Welcome to the thematic session 7 on diversity in disaster risk reduction leadership. I am Amel Riden. I am from Tunisia. I am a young Tunisian climate change negotiator, and I hold also the private sector hat as I work at a Pan-African private equity firm called Africanvest. I'm super honored to be your co-moderator today, along with my friend Abel, who will be introducing himself in a bit. And I'm really looking forward to our speakers' notes across this session. So before we started and before we hand it over to our honorable guests, let me ask you a question. Who among you has worked with an inspiring leader? You can answer by raising your hands. Have you worked before with an inspiring leader? Have you worked with someone you think or you thought that was inspiring? Maybe by show of hands, if you can raise up your hands. Okay, we've got some inspiring colleagues. I want you now to reflect and think, how have they been? Have they been similar to you? Were you share always the same thoughts? Did they provide some different perspectives to the room? Okay, let that in your minds. Now, more specifically, it's about you. Who has been personally an inspiring leader? And don't be shy again with the raise of hands. Do you think of a moment, yeah, we're all humble in here, but do you think of a moment where you yourself was inspiring and brought something inspirational to the room? Okay, what makes you a good leader? We don't often ask ourselves these questions, but it's important to acknowledge that it's so often the diversity in the room that brings forward a lot of interesting outcomes. There is no shortage of information and research that shows that diverse teams with diverse and inclusive leadership perform much better and reach out to more effective conclusions. Yet often, the people who are disproportionately more impacted by disasters are the ones that are least represented in disaster risk reduction, leadership, and decision-making roles. This includes, but not limited to, women, young people, older people, indigenous people in rural and urban communities, LGBTQI+, migrants, refugees, and a lot of people who might have a lot of these. Disasters affect people differently due to the ways which our social systems and intersecting forms of discrimination are impacting people in their resources, in their capacities, in their vulnerabilities, in their decision-making powers. Yet, vulnerability and exposure of certain groups to disaster risks are economically, socially, and culturally dependent, and here they can therefore be reduced. In today's session, we are going to explore together how diverse leadership can accelerate the implementation of the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction in an inclusive and effective way. We'll consider both the common and specific challenges and risks that diverse groups face, and how the structural barrier and capacity gaps, discriminatory attitudes and stereotypes restrict their participation and how we address them. We will also hear about the primary enablers to diverse and transformative GRR, and of course share good examples about how this is going, how this is working, and the impact, how impactful this has been. Before starting, and I personally look forward to this session, I want to hand it over to my co-moderator Abel, who will walk us through some housekeeping rules. Over to you, Abel.
Yeah, thank you so much, my co-moderator Amal. I'm happy to moderate this session with you. And first of all, everyone in the room, you're welcome. And this is a very interesting session. Leadership is very critical if we are to move the Sendai Framework forward, but also if we are to achieve the targets that we set out in 2015. So we recognize the member. First of all, before we recognize the members online, my name is Abel Wilson Warefa, and I come from Uganda. And I'm happy to see a delegation from the Ugandan team here. Please, you're welcome, and please enjoy the diversity and leadership session we're going to have, but also everyone from across the world. I am a member of Africa Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction, This is a youth network that was set up by African Union Commission as one of the ways for meaningful children and youth engagement in disaster risk reduction. So this platform was set up in May 2019. And so if we want to learn of the best practices in including the children and youth, then Africa has a good case study for us to learn from. And we are happy to share lessons on what has worked well so far. Okay, just to take you through some of the housekeeping rules for our session. We recognize the friends who are joining us virtually, and please thank you so much for making efforts to join us. I want to inform you that we have interpretation available in the 6 UN languages, and so you just click and choose the language that you're comfortable with. It is important for you to mute the audio, for you to listen to the preferred language and the interpretation. If you don't mute the audio, you'll keep hearing 2 languages at the same time. Also to inform you, we have a pre-recorded video, and actually there are 2 of them. We will play them because we want you to have a feel of what is happening in the community for us to learn and then discuss and dissect it even better. So we'll also have a poll and shall have a Q&A session later on because we want to hear from you, we want to engage you, we want to pick your brain and your mind on how we can have inclusive leadership for DRR. And just to share with you that we are going to be using slido.com using our mobile phones. And so there is a code that you've seen on the screen for members who are in the room. For the team that's joining us online, I know you're using Hopin, and please just look out for the poll sessions and the Q&A that will be coming in later on. And if you're finding any technical challenges in using Hopin, please get our support from the technical team online through the chat box. And so, welcome and looking forward to learning from you, but also interacting with you. Over to you, my co-moderator.
Thank you so much, Abel. And I think it's about time that we introduce our honorable speakers. So I will start with Ms. Lisa Fabienne. Ms. Lisa is an avid advocate of disaster risk reduction in the private sector. She is the executive director of Dominica's Association of Industry and Commerce, and also serves as immediate past chairperson of the Network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce. She leads the DRR pillar for the Caribbean Chambers of Commerce and was recently appointed as a member of the Global Arise Board. Next to me is Ms. Sarah Nibbs, who is the officer in charge of the UN Women Asia and the Pacific Regional Office. She has worked in the Asia-Pacific region for the last 25 years with a range of organizations, including but not limited to UN Women, UNFPA, DFID China, and a variety of other NGOs and CSOs. Her work focuses on gender, violence against women, HIV youth issues, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. We also have with us Mr. David Zambrano Maya, who is a native of the Olon commune in Ecuador. He has been a member of the Community Risk Management Committee of Olon since 2018, where he is recognized for his leadership and altruistic spirit, and where he was also elected as a president of the community in 2020. He has led activities related to prevention and community preparedness, and he is the coordinator of the foundation We Make It Possible, which supports priority groups through the consequences of COVID-19. He is also currently studying his 2nd semester of Tourism Management and Development and his 1st semester of Masters of Social Management and Development. We also have our online speaker who will be joining us virtually from Nadi, Fiji, Ms. Nolene Nabulivu, who is a feminist community organizer, an analyst, educator, and activist working for socio-economic, ecological, and climate justice and universal human rights in urban informal settlements in Fiji. She has been working globally for over 35 years. Guided by the autonomous feminist movements, she works with communities, governments, development sectors, and the UN to advance bold heterodox strategies on urgent and complex questions of human rights and development justice. She is also the recipient of the International Women's Health Coalition's John B. Dunlap Award for Advocacy. And last but not least, we have with us Ms. Ilham Yusufian, who joined the International Disability Alliance Secretariat in November 2019 as the Inclusive Humanitarian Action and DRR Advisor. She is responsible for leading and coordinating the implementation of IDA's strategy to promote and support the effective enforcement of inclusive humanitarian action and disaster risk reduction. So, without further ado, I think it's about time that we hand it over to our honorable speakers, and I will start with Ms. Lizra Fabian. Ms. Lizra, so you are working with the private sector, and we know that historically this has been a male-dominated sector, but at the same time it is where most evidence comes in terms of proofs that diversity is actually positively affecting the organizational performance and the team's performance. So can you share with us whether you have experienced personally yourself or whether you have seen it come across your teams? What are the primarily enablers to diverse and transformative leadership? Also, whether how you have seen this effectively integrated into disaster risk reduction, as it is the topic of our session today. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and I'm really pleased to share perspectives of the private sector. So some of the primary enablers of diversity and transformative leadership that I have experienced is where we have champions and supporters of diversity. It's important to have persons who would lead that charge as opposed to being passive in how we approach diversity and transformative leadership. Another key part of that is unity of a common goal. So where we see that this is what we're working towards, and we're not fighting each other in being able to move towards transformative and diverse leadership. But it's also known that the private sector is quite innovative, and we're also quite flexible. So seeing that within the private sector, and even in my experience, I think that has helped us to move towards more transformative leadership. But you also asked how this is integrated into disaster risk reduction. So similarly, the private sector in disaster risk reduction seeks to be resilient. And if being resilient means that we are transformative, that's something that we must do because it will impact the bottom line, it will impact our organization. And finally, in terms of lessons that I've learned of how this has been important for more inclusive leadership in DRR, we must be cognizant of our biases. If we are not mindful that this is a bias, we'll not be able to move past that point. And it's important that we are courageous, we're able to be fair in how we operate within our organizations, but of course, collaboration is key. And we know with the private sector, if we operate in silos, we'll not be able to be as transformative as we need to. So similarly, in disaster risk reduction within the private sector, even with our network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce, we've learned these lessons to help us to be more transformative.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Lizra, for sharing with us those very important insights. You clearly bring out that we need to be very courageous and we need to collaborate if we are to push the DRR agenda forward. But also you clearly state that as a private sector and also public sector, we need to be resilient in all our actions, but also in our decisions. Okay, so I'll go to the next panelist, and that is my colleague on my next left. That's Ms. Ilham. So, Ms. Ilham, we know that DRR leadership at all levels does not adequately reflect the range of lived experiences among the communities, but also in different groups of people impacted by disasters. This may be true and this may not be true. You will share with us. But just from your experience, for example, in 2011, earthquakes and tsunami in Japan affected very many people, but most importantly, the disabled people were highly affected. I just want to pick your mind and just want to pick your views share with us some of your insights. How has it been?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Regarding participation of persons with disabilities in disaster risk reduction, I have to mention that, unfortunately, persons with disabilities are rarely represented at leadership positions in general. And when it comes to emergency leadership, the situation is even more challenging because it is assumed that disaster and emergency response requires skills that people think persons with disabilities lack. But the reality is that we are living in a society full of barriers for persons with disabilities. So all persons with disabilities have to overcome different types of barriers for fulfilling daily tasks and to grow in the society and achieve their goals. So we are used to, and overcoming barriers and challenges is part of our daily lives for the most simple tasks that you can even imagine. That means that persons with disabilities have additional specific skills to find solutions that most of the time doesn't even come to mind for other people. And I really believe that this has been really overlooked by the humanity. And I really believe that persons with disabilities, because of these coping mechanisms that we have developed, have a lot of solutions that could provide if they could access leadership positions in disaster and emergency response and management. However, there are multiple barriers that keep us away from accessing leadership positions in disaster response and management. Most importantly is the attitudinal barrier, or what we call stigma. People hear about persons with disabilities, they just view them or us as subjects of pity, people who we need to feel sorry for, people who are need to get some fixation, some support, they cannot see. Hopefully there would be a surgery so they can see, they cannot hear, so hopefully the science would progress and they can hear, hopefully there would be solutions for them. So they are assumed as people who need fixation and need to be revised so that they can live a better life. Nobody sees persons with disabilities as agents of change and leaders. In the best scenario and the most progressed setups, they say, okay, persons with disabilities can manage disability issues. So we see that in some governments, in some UN agencies and some civil society, private sector, we see some persons with disabilities are being able to lead positions that are relevant to disability inclusion. But nobody thinks that we can do much more than that. It's not just limited to issues of disability inclusion. A person with disability who is an engineer, and we have them among us, can be a very good disaster management person, which has nothing to do with disability per se. They can be a general mainstream leader. A lawyer with disability can provide legal support for general issues, so it doesn't need to be limited to disability issues. Everything concerns us, so we can be leaders on everything. There are also other barriers that hinder participation of persons with disabilities as leaders. So for example, career developments are quite limited for persons with disabilities. Let me give one quick example and wrap up. We have our deaf friends who use sign language for communication that you can see in the room today being interpreted in international sign for them. So how a deaf person can be a leader if their language that they speak is not even being recognized and is not even being provided? Imagine you go somewhere and people expect you to lead and do the job, but nobody speaks your language and nobody bothers to translate for you. So while these barriers exist, The world is depriving itself from potential great contribution and input of 15% of the world population who are persons with disabilities. And I really hope that in the second half of the implementation of the Sendai Framework, we can find solutions to benefit from leadership of persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eloham, for those insights. And thank you so much for being very elaborate. You've clearly shown us and also pointed out some of the areas that we must think about today as we are coming up with a position paper from this GP 2022. So I'm going to bring her back for us to continue tapping from her wisdom. But for now, we want to have a short video, and then from there we'll bring her back for more insights.
I remember first time that I have to learn how to walk again. And the only time that I'll do that was every Sunday when all the church members, all the villagers are in church. Being a person who is with disabilities and also identified as a person of diverse soldiers, growing up in the community is a challenge, continuous challenge of getting stigma and discriminations and even name calling.
Jay, as our focal point for the Fiji Disabled Peoples Federation, obviously really helps us drive that intersectional, inclusive agenda, which is part of our feminist principles and values. So Jay represents the Fiji Disabled Peoples Federation, but is also able to connect with other women with disabilities networks through the Pacific Disability Forum's Women with Disability Network. So that's really important.
Something that always excites me the most is to keep on, engage us with our community. So for us at Fiji Disabled, we have 16 branches. So the continuous communication and visitation, reaching out to them in terms of capacity building, and then the next time we may be responding to the disasters, and most importantly, like I always mention, that putting a smile on a person's face during their darkest hour.
Jay brings a rural experience as well, which I think is really, really important if we want to drive an inclusive localization agenda. And I can recall a couple of years ago when Jay was actually talking about infrastructure in evacuation centers because it was just so important for disability inclusion.
I was part of a group of individuals that has set up a community organization back in the north for people with diverse soldiers, and creating that small group and having that space was something we feel it was important because we had not had a particular space where our community can always come in and share their opinion and concern. Having diversity in decision making, there are also a meaning having that intersectional approach in every decision that we are making, in preparedness work for everyone, not only as a certain group, but everyone means persons with disability, people with diverse soldiers. They are informed and they're also being consulted. The work of disaster risk reduction.
That was indeed very inspiring, and it's one of the many, many stories that we are facing in our world. And diversity should really be recognized as something to be recognized for as an outstanding factor rather than a factor that is leaving people behind. And I'm keen also to continue the conversation in our panel today to know how, what kind of barriers our panelists are facing. And now I'm moving to Mr. David Zambrano Maya. So David, you have been elected as president of the Community Risk Management Committee in Olon Commune. And the leadership of communities, nationalities, and ancestral people in disaster risk reduction is definitely key. And you're also very young. So we're keen to know, how have the barriers that restricted the meaningful participation of diverse groups have been in your case in the Olon community? And what do you want to achieve with leadership from these small communities? And it would be also interesting if you can tell us about who inspires you as a leader. I would just like to note that David will make his intervention in Spanish, so please proceed to having the translation sets should you not have them. Over to you, David.
Saludos cordiales a todos y todas las presentes de manera especial y a los organizadores de este importante evento. Un afectuoso también a quienes siguen esta transmisión alrededor del mundo. Quiero iniciar esta intervención contándole sobre mi país. Mi país es un país democrático, pluricultural y multiétnico. La Constitución de la República en el año 2018 incluyó la gestión del riesgo y desastres como un derecho ciudadano al mismo nivel que la educación y la salud o seguridad. Y en este contexto se organiza el Sistema Nacional Descentralizado de Gestión de Riesgos, en el cual forman parte y formo parte de los comités comunitarios de gestión de riesgos. Respecto a su pregunta, quiero reafirmar que el liderazgo de la sociedad civil organizada para la reducción de riesgo de desastres es clave. Desde mi experiencia y el entorno de la comunidad, hemos tenido que afrontar barreras. Son muy grandes, pero no imposibles. En el entorno de mi comunidad hemos tenido, pues, aquellas como frases o paradigmas: aquí nunca ha ocurrido nada y por lo tanto no va a pasar. Y cuando esto está en la conciencia de nuestras personas, de nuestra gente, es difícil romper estos paradigmas, pero no es imposible. El otro obstáculo que hemos tenido que afrontar es la poca sensibilidad de las autoridades. Esto se refleja en la falta de planificación en torno al manejo de las riesgos. Faltan políticas, sobre todo públicas y locales, que avalen un correcto manejo del riesgo para nuestras comunidades. Es decir, tenemos estrategias nacionales, pero aún no logran articularlas a escala locales. Y eso lo deben trabajar los tomadores de decisiones. En el mismo sentido, la planificación para el desarrollo apenas incorpora la gestión del riesgo de desastre en sus planes de desarrollo y ordenamiento territorial. La falta de participación de la empresa privada también es una barrera que debemos superar. Lo que no es un negocio no nos interesa. Y la realidad, trabajar y reducir el riesgo se puede considerar como una inversión a futuro. Hace falta el financiamiento y el acompañamiento para la reducción del riesgo de desastres y la preparación para sus respuestas. También tenemos muchas dificultades, como abordar el liderazgo con enfoques de derechos humanos, géneros y inclusión. Sin embargo, estos retos nos han empujado a seguir trabajando aún más. Por ello es que en mi comunidad y las comunidades vecinas decidimos organizarnos y participar en todas las actividades que se proponen. Creamos un comité comunitario de gestión de riesgo, ejecutamos el proyecto de guardaplayas, que incluyen acciones de rescate y cuidado en espacios naturales en nuestras playas. Fomentamos actividades en grupos de pioneros donde participan niños y niñas adolescentes. Apoyamos a nuestros vecinos afectados durante la pandemia del COVID-19 mediante la entrega puerta a puerta de insumos, higienes, alimentos y controles de medidas sanitarias. A nivel nacional existen 745 comités comunitarios de gestión de riesgos, el cual formo parte de uno y 7 más que se encuentran en la parroquia Mangaralto de la península de Santa Elena. Debo resaltar la importancia que tiene el acompañamiento del Servicio Nacional de Gestión de Riesgos y Emergencias. Junto al sector académico, en este caso, puedo nombrar instituciones como la Escuela Politécnica del Litoral SPOL, ya que tenemos 4 trabajando en proyectos juntos, con acciones pequeñas pero concretas, que han sabido darle sentido de pertenencia a los que realizamos y a los habitantes de nuestra comuna Olón, y además ha logrado intervenir en el gobierno y la empresa privada. Cabe recalcar que aún hay mucho que hacer. Es verdad que soy joven, como muchos de mis compañeros de diferentes comités comunitarios lo mencionan, pero aceptamos el reto de seguir adelante por el bienestar de nuestras poblaciones, asumiendo nuevas responsabilidades cada día, porque creemos que el riesgo debe ser gestionado desde la misma comunidad para el desarrollo de los territorios resilientes y aún más en una hermosa tierra como lo es de donde provengo, la comuna Olón, tierra de grandes culturas y eterna primavera del mar, que día a día busca ser un ponente turístico y estar preparado ante cualquier evento de riesgo para proteger a nuestros habitantes y a las personas que nos visitan. Queremos alcanzar el liderazgo de una organización pequeña. Como una comunidad, queremos que la sociedad comprenda que la reducción del riesgo y desastre no es solo responsabilidad del Estado, sino también de nosotros mismos. Por ello necesitamos un liderazgo fuerte en las organizaciones comunitarias y que sean apoyadas permanentemente las instituciones locales. Respondiendo a quien me inspira como líder, debo decir con mucha gratitud que me inspira mucho a seguir laborando en todo lo que realizo. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much, David. That is the diversity we are talking about. So we have the youth among the moderators, we have Spanish in, we have English in, and soon we'll have French in. Of course, it's already going in the interpretation. Okay, so we continue with our panelists. So let's turn to our colleague who is joining us, and that is Noerin. So Noerin, you've been working in this space for the last 35 years. What has been some of those successful actions, but also enablers for diverse and transformative leadership in DRR and resilience building? What have you seen over years? What worked?
To be in this really important panel. And so the first thing I would say is let's be real. Pacific women, Pacific people, our governments, we've all been part of climate change, climate justice, and DRR and biodiversity work for decades. Sometimes we work well together with each other, with nation states, development agencies. Sometimes we don't. But regardless of that, any of us with goodwill and an understanding of where we are in the world right now, in the ecocidal context in which we live right now, know that if we live in a climate frontline state with multiple disasters that we encounter most years now, I would say every year now, with people like myself who are working on climate change and DRR and human rights, while we've also been recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, there are complicated coloniality struggles still going on in our region and elsewhere that continue. There's all the geopolitics that lays, even more layers onto the DRR complexity that we face. But I mean, the reality is we're living in a living planet that has 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries overshot. There's 200 species a day going extinct, 80% of forests gone, 90% of coral reefs under threat. And this arc of global warming keeps going. And there's a number of countries who are protecting elite polluters and chronic emitters and not paying the minimum required $100 billion per year since 2020. That's supposed to rise again in 2025. And some of our Pacific family are at risk now of having no land above the waterline in decades to come because of sea level rise and this continued global warming. So this isn't just about disaster response, it's about civilizational shifts that we require for survival and for intergenerational effects. We've been talking about youth-led efforts, and why is the struggle so much on the shoulders of young people and women and others? It's because we know what the consequences are and why the leadership and inclusive leadership is so important. That people have to be able to come into this work and find a place to contribute from where and what they know best and what they know most. So we have to talk, first of all, in this issue of leadership on multiple forms of knowledge and skills, and that includes Indigenous and local knowledge. We ourselves have over 6,000 women and people who are part of our network in the Pacific called Women Defending the Commons. And we defend the air, the water, the oceans, the soil, the biodiversity, and more. And over 10 years, we work closely with many, many allies and accomplices. And we work out what we can do with them, with each other. It's not always the same. So it might be a feminist group, or it might be Songson Gavakmarama Itoke, which is the oldest indigenous group in the country. It might be a government. It might be the Shifting the Power Coalition, whom you just saw on that video prior. We're also part of the Women's Major Group and the Women Gender Constituency to the UNFCCC, and groups like We Do and others at the global level. Why that? Because leadership has to be everywhere from local to global, but most important, it needs to be of people and of organizations and of social movements that are speaking deeply, listening deeply to each other. The work on DRR, as we all know, is incredibly nuanced, and so the leadership too must be. So we know that some of the calls that we're making are about meaningful engagement and leadership of women in all areas of DRR. And there has to be a focus on grassroots, on young women, on LGBTQI people, on femme and gender non-binary people, people with disabilities, poor and disenfranchised women, the women who are in informal settlements, might be in rural or maritime areas. We can't treat it as homogeneity. And we still do, unfortunately, in many cases. We say we don't, but often the frames and the structures and the processes tell you something different from that. Second, to realize the commitments on localization, we have to include work on elimination of violence against women, on gender justice, on social flaw and social protection, on infrastructure and transport. It's on things like disaster risk reduction strategies that are in vernacular. And we still have problems of that in many, many countries, including my own. Third, it's about promotion of bodily autonomy and integrity. If you have women, we have double the global rates of violence against women here in Fiji. And if you have that reality, as many do around the world, then we know that it's very hard for people to be in leadership in disaster risk and response or in any other leadership area. If we are doing 76% of the unpaid care work as women around the world, which the ILO says, then our bodies are being broken by the level of work and lack of rest and leisure. And these cycles of disasters that we have to then work on, supposedly as leaders, then also become a further burden on all of our bodies. As CEDAW General Recommendation 36 states, it's only when people are able to realize their sexual and reproductive health and rights and their human rights overall that their capacity to engage in work for climate disasters and ecological justice is even possible. We have 6 countries in the Pacific where homosexuality isn't even decriminalized yet. So that's a bare baseline before we can talk about diverse leadership. And there's 71 countries around the world in the same place. Fourth, when we're talking about issues of financing for disaster risk and response, we now know that less than 1% of the funding for climate change and DRR actually comes to autonomous civil society organizations in the majority South. And that is something that we have to talk a lot about how are we funding it by those who are called to be at the front line. We have to be making sure that we look at leadership in a different way. We clearly know that it's not just men, but if you look at the leaders, the photos of our leaders meeting, you'd be confused because the numbers of women leaders at plenipotentiary or national, regional, and global level are very few and far between. And that has to change if DRR leadership is to change. And let's all be clear that DRR leaders are not only the government civil servants, though they are wonderful in our country, in our many countries dealing with disasters, but they're not just religious, just village headmen. They are the women community elders who every day are doing this set of work. Women group leaders, village nurses, youth leaders. In my country and region, we talk a lot about the fact that there's so few women leaders in the top development and academic institutions, even in crop agencies. Many of the volunteers who are actually the ones who are poorest and who make the least living as poverty rises in our countries are also the frontline providers. They're the volunteers. And we have to be able to talk about the issues of compensation. Otherwise, their leadership becomes doubly exploitative, especially when conditionalities are placed on them on how to do their work. And let's be clear, DRR often can be incredibly difficult to weave and to wind and to find your way through. So the resentment that rises with all of those conditions from people who maybe are not experiencing these conditions that many of us who are doing the frontline work are doing, with very little support and resources to move that work in a long-term substantive way. So it's incredibly important for the government and prop agencies and the UN to work with local autonomous-led social groups and organizations who already have established networks on the ground, who are working with grassroots communities. Because during COVID-19, during all of these cyclones, these are the ways that we worked in our networks through these 12 provinces and around the Pacific. We were able to contact each other with telephone trees. We were able to respond quickly, to be flexible. So you have to have good relationships with those in various government ministries. You have to be able to work quietly to get supplies packed, to be sent on government and private boats and ferries, to be flexible in your leadership, to talk to people from principals in schools through to Turanganikoros or village administrators, to be able to talk to transport suppliers. These are incredibly amazing skills. Yes, I'm over time. Thank you, thank you. So I would just say, the last thing I'd like to say is that effective, inclusive leadership is demanding change for real change in our global setting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I can see a lot of nodding heads in the room, so we can only agree with what you have been saying, and I think this sets perfectly the scene to my next question to Ms. Sarah. I think that our speakers have touched based upon a lot of barriers and challenges, and some of these overlap, some of these are specific to a particular set of sectors, and here I want to specifically talk about women inclusion or women leadership in DRR. So I want to know from you, and based on your experience and what you have been to, what do you think are the main drivers of success to actually including women in DRR decision making? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal, and thank you to all of the panel for the amazing sharing. It's really inspiring actually to sit on this panel with you all. I think that you shared some really interesting key barriers and enablers of change in this conversation, and I just want to pick on a couple of specific things. I mean, I think several of my fellow panelists have really emphasized the point that this is not just about vulnerability. This is about reframing how we see people, not seeing them as vulnerable victims, but as seeing people as agents of change. This is a continuous conversation we have about women, and I was very, very struck by what Elham shared about people with disabilities, that actually people's life experience gives them particular strengths in overcoming certain challenges that are really relevant to them as leaders and actors in the struggle for DRR. So I just think this is something we need to really, really bear in mind. I also really appreciated the reminder that Lizra gave us that we need to be cognizant of the biases that we need to really unpick our thinking. And for me, again, this comes back to thinking about who people are. You know, it's much more than just being victims or people who are especially vulnerable. I really appreciated all of the focus on intersectionality, on what David brought on collaboration and local ownership, and that funding needs to go to the right places. It needs to go to where people actually are seeing the impact of disaster and can make the right decisions. And finally, just to really reiterate the connections that Nolene built between the complexity of the DRR challenges and how that creates the need for a really inclusive leadership. Because, you know, people are what embodies the complexity, and it's within people that we can find the solutions when we look at this in a really inclusive way. In terms of the kind of ingredients that we see from our experience with UN Women, and I must say also from our close collaborations with other UN agencies like UNDRR, UNFPA, as well as with civil society and governments, we have seen several sort of key factors. The first one, as I mentioned, is that we really need to reiterate the fact that women are important agents of change and leaders. We also need to look into capacity. We too often speak about women as not having capacity, and actually we may often find that women's machineries, women's CSOs may be made to feel and may feel this is a technical area, perhaps we don't have the knowledge to engage in this. So it is actually important that we have very targeted capacity building to ensure that people who need to be part of this conversation, who need to be leaders in the conversation, are equipped to go into the right fora and to make their arguments and to take the lead. We also need to really focus on cooperation and partnerships. And I think that as international organizations, as UN organizations, we need to be very mindful that we have a critical convening role in bringing all of the different partners together at the table, because partnerships are essential if we want to be inclusive and really reflect diversity. I also want to go back to what David mentioned around financing. I think we know that generally women's machineries and women's organizations are underfunded globally. And so all of us who are in decision-making roles need to make funding decisions that send money in the right direction, and also continue to advocate with governments, with donors, to ensure that women's organizations and national women's machineries are adequately financed to engage. I think I also just want to reiterate that the kinds of changes that we want to see really also need to be systemic. We need to look at normative and governance changes. So if this means looking at having targets in terms of how many women are in leadership roles, if this means temporary special measures, we have to look at how we can use those mechanisms to ensure that women are at the table. And just finally, it's very important that we do share the good practices and the gender-specific tools and the really targeted guidance materials that we have. So a conference like this, of course, is an opportunity for this kind of sharing, but also just to say, just as one example from UN Women, our Women's Resilience to Disasters Knowledge Hub is a new initiative where we will try to bring together knowledge, expertise, and good practice so that women around the world can learn from one another. So thank you so much, Amal.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for bringing those insights and ingredients to our discussion today. And you come up with some of the possible recommendations that we need to pronounce ourselves with after this session. Just my moderator, I want just to share with you some few best practices from my country. That is Uganda. I want to share with you that the DRR platform, the national DRR platform, has a good mix of males and females. I think it is 50-50. But also I want to share with you the good practice that African Union Commission did when they were setting up the Africa Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction. They made sure that we have 7 females and we have 7 males. Yeah, so I think it is key and it's very critical. And by the way, we are working very, very well. And you really see that the female voices are well represented. Okay, so we are going to play another short video. But before we play the video, we are excited that you are already engaging us and you're already setting in questions. We are going to have a Q&A session shortly. And we are excited that very interesting questions are coming in. Please, panelists, prepare for very nice questions there. People are engaging us and they are following the conversation very closely. So we are going to have a poll now. And please log on. And we have a short question that we want to pick your brain on. And the question is, what are the key drivers of success to inclusive leadership? I repeat, what are the key drivers of success to inclusive leadership? So please log on to the poll and please respond. We will share with you the responses just after the video. For now, let's have the second video. So as the video is coming on, like I have said earlier, okay.
In Bangladesh, women were once identified as the most vulnerable to disasters, but that scenario is substantially changed. CPP, established by the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, is stepping in its 50th year. The organization is now recognized as a global role model. This achievement goes to the credits of all dedicated volunteers, including 27 life sacrifice souls. Today, 76,000 volunteers are working in this program, half of whom are women. The women volunteers, equipped with proper training and skill, are now ready to combat cyclones. It is an unprecedented development in gender equality. To bring this parity of women in CPP, Honourable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina inaugurated inclusion of new 18,505 women volunteers on International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction 2020. The widespread participation of women volunteers has led to a significant increase in mass awareness on cyclone preparedness in the coastal areas, particularly among the female population. As a result, the number of women and child deaths in cyclones has reduced remarkably. Women who used to be considered as the most vulnerable are now leading half of the response force. Transforming from a homemaker to a responder, CPP women volunteers are working as agents of change. Thus, Bangladesh is moving towards a gender-responsive, sustainable development.
I think that's another best practice that is shared with us for inspirational matters today, and I think that also links super closely with the question. So maybe it's about time that we check the answers we've received in the poll. As a reminder, the question that was shared with you via Slido: what are the key drivers of success to inclusive leadership? If we can have the answers to this poll. And please continue answering. We will welcome these answers, and they will feed in the discussion for this thematic session. Maybe as we are expecting the answers to be shown in the screen, we have also welcomed your questions. So, okay, we have the answers now. Maybe, Abel, do we want to go through some of these answers?
Okay, so I can take you some of them. So first of all, the question was, what are the key drivers to success in inclusive leadership in DRR? One, member that's saying that we need to have the HR policies, or I think DRR policies that support parents of all gender. We need to formalize roles of grassroots women and communities in DRR. We need to institutionalize grassroots women and other group leadership. We need to have resourcing and recognizing their efforts to scale action that reduce risks. So that's the issue of women inclusion coming out strongly. We need to respect to enable horizontal relations among equals. We must have political commitment, advocacy, and awareness. We need to have meaningful engagement. Now, we need to define the word meaningful engagement. Meaningful engagement. I think one of the panelists will help us to define the word meaningful engagement, such that as we get out of this place, because all of us here are leaders, but also all of us interact with leaders. So we need to have a definition of meaningful engagement.
Yes, maybe Abel, linking back to this question, and please keep the answers coming, I would like to bring our first question maybe to Ms. Ilham. And the question says, like, how can human rights-based leadership be implemented? So if you'd be kind to answer this question received from our attendees and delegates.
Well, actually, human rights-based approach is the ultimate solution of diverse leadership, because if we really implement human rights, that means that we see equal rights for everybody, and we recognize equal value of everybody. Everybody has rights and potentials and responsibilities, of course, as humans. So no one is inferior or superior. So rights-based approach, if truly implemented, would mean that everybody are recognized as right holders, everybody would have access to opportunities that is needed for their development, and everybody would have access to leadership positions. So for example, there would be efforts, because as we know, in human rights we talk about respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So if this is really implemented, the government would have responsibility to make sure that the facilities required, the positive actions required are being taken so that people can grow, people can acquire the skills required for taking the leadership. There is no barrier, there is possibility, there is path to grow, and then a diverse leadership will happen naturally afterwards. So there is a 100% relationship between right-based approach and diverse leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Ilham. And moving to the second question, I will address this question to Mr. David. So the question says, how are community leaders using warning technology to persuade community to act on early warning messages and evacuate when needed? I will repeat the question. So how are community leaders using warning technology to persuade community to act on early warning messages and evacuate when needed?
Ok, la mejor manera de prevenir mediante los dispositivos y diferentes mecanismos informáticos o tecnologías de prevención a nuestras comunidades es de la mano con nosotros mismos. Nosotros somos aquellos promotores, los primeros gestores del manejo del riesgo. Nosotros como líderes debemos tener el convencimiento, el poder de la palabra y sobre todo la diversidad al momento de abordar estos temas. Nosotros somos los que debemos transmitir la seguridad. Nosotros debemos transmitir las buenas prácticas de supervivencia, las buenas prácticas del manejo del riesgo ante nuestra comunidad. Es verdad que la tecnología y los diferentes medios pueden advertirnos, pueden llevarnos mucho más allá, pero nada está comparado con el poder de liderazgo que reside en cada uno de nosotros. Porque nosotros, para poder empoderarnos de decisión y poder obtener un correcto manejo del riesgo, debemos empoderarnos nosotros mismos como líderes para poder empoderar el tema y así poder seguir a nuestras comunidades y decir, esto es lo que se debe hacer. Muchas comunidades son turísticas hoy en día, como lo es aquí en Bali, Indonesia. Sabemos que todos estamos, la mayor parte de América y Sudamérica, ubicados en un cinturón de fuego de constantes placas tectónicas, de constantes sismos, de constantes peligros, pero no hay nada mejor que nosotros poder impartir ese conocimiento, no solo con los adultos, sino también desde el hogar, en las instituciones educativas y con apoyo de la empresa privada y sobre todo de los gobiernos centrales y descentralizados que hoy por hoy deben sumarse a la gestión del riesgo como prioridad para el desarrollo económico y el desarrollo territorial de cada uno de los países y naciones que pues realmente deben manejar el riesgo como un factor clave para su desarrollo.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for those who are providing us with these insightful questions, and I hope this is addressing some of your concerns. Moving on to a third question, and I'm asking this question to Ms. Lisa. So you've shared with us the perspective of the private sector, but also from female leader. And here the question is about another perspective that I would like to get your thoughts on. So the question says, what is the best way to engage youth in DRR program design and implementation? And I'm personally curious, and I would second this question as well.
Well, the best way to engage youth is to really, like we say, focus on inclusion. Seeing that we have a common goal that we're working towards, and none or pushing aside the young persons because of their age. I am a youth in my country. I am below 35, so I classify as a youth. And even from my experience, we had Hurricane Maria, and there was a gap that was present, and I stepped in to fill that gap. Some persons may have shunned me like, what are you doing sitting at this table? But my responsibility was not to feel like I'm cast aside because someone asked me about my age, but to really step in. There were persons who encouraged me in that process. So I think how we can include youth in DRR is including youth in the conversation, encouraging them to step up and fill the gap where it exists, ensuring that we don't look at leadership in diversity or leadership in DRR as just the older persons and the male, but also as even the youngest among us can teach us. So encouraging everyone who's an adult here who is above 35, beyond my age group, to ensure that we look out for the young persons and encourage them to step in, take advantage of the opportunities, fill the gap so that they could be leaders in DRR.
Thank you so much, and that's definitely super needed as we are heading towards the challenges we are facing, and it's important to make sure that everyone has the seat they are deserving and that they are requiring. I think we have a last question before we go and check again the answers, and thank you for your meaningful participation. I see like there is 60 persons who have provided their answers, and some other delegates are still typing, so please keep on sharing with us your thoughts, and these key drivers are necessary to keep the conversation going, both on some exchanges, but also on the implementation level. My first question is to Ms. Sarah. So the question says, how do we encourage both government and non-government for zero tolerance against sexual exploitation and harassment from humanitarian actors? I will repeat the question. I think it's a bit complex. How do we encourage both governments and non-government for zero tolerance against sexual exploitation and harassment from humanitarian actors?
Thanks so much for raising that really important question. Look, I think what we already know is that there are, this is a case where there are actually some strong policies in place, where many organizations that are active in the humanitarian space do have, clear policies for the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. But I think this is also a clear case where we need to really be very mindful all the time of the potential implementation gap. And of course, this is what the question is getting at, is how can we really demonstrate that zero tolerance? So I think there's a couple of things that we need to do. I think the first one is recognizing that wherever we sit, this is an issue. Unfortunately, it is happening everywhere. Just because it's hidden and not reported and not spoken about, that just tells us that this is the one kind of crime where actually the survivor often is feeling guilt because of social norms and discrimination and doesn't speak out. So the first thing is acknowledging that this really happens wherever we sit and recognizing that. The second is in the preparation. It's in ensuring that everybody who works with us is told consistently that this is a behavior that cannot be tolerated, and also ensuring that our staff and colleagues and partners who work with us understand how we define sexual exploitation and abuse, what it means, why you might not hear about it, why people might be quiet about it, all of these dimensions that need to be understood. And then thirdly, it's about being very serious in how we respond to a case when it is raised, ensuring that we really demonstrate that zero tolerance, that there are consequences and that we follow through. So I think these are just some of the practices that we can try to implement to combat this really serious issue that can obviously is a massive human rights violation and also can undermine all of the work that we try to do.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And I think we never speak enough about it. So also thank you for the person who has raised this question. And this is also among the key drivers of success to inclusive leadership, which we are asking our audience to. So Abel, maybe if we can also check on some of the answers we have received. And yeah, I think we have now 63 persons who have shared with us their thoughts about what could be a key driver of success to an inclusive leadership in disaster risk reduction.
Okay, so apologies. Some of them are in French, and I'm not very good at French, but and that is part of inclusion. If we don't read the French views, are you good at French?
Yeah, but that's Spanish.
Please read.
It's a Spanish. Yeah.
Okay. It's a Spanish. Okay. Okay, so we can read those ones. You know, reading that would really, I think let's give chance to David to read for us that Spanish statement or feedback. Please, IT team, bring it back. Okay. It is up there. I'm interested in that Spanish version. We need to have inclusion even when we are here. David, can you read that statement? Feedback.
Por supuesto, generando espacios de participación ciudadana, tanto en la planificación como en la toma de decisiones para la reducción del riesgo de desastres. Realmente, manejar y crear espacios no podemos decirlo como tal, porque los espacios están creados, los espacios hay, simplemente debemos empoderarnos de esta situación. Muchas veces hay personas que se desaniman cuando tienen un no por respuesta, cuando hay tal vez objetivos o trasfondos que no le convienen, como decíamos hace un rato en misión, cuando no es un negocio, no nos interesa. Pero sin embargo, esta pregunta va dirigida en que los mismos gobiernos locales, desde las mismas comunidades, desde las mismas entrañas de las bases de la sociedad, se deben empoderar y tal vez yo no lo diría como crear, sino más bien ampliar hacia una diversidad de liderazgo, porque no solo tenemos personas adultas con experiencia, con títulos, sino también tenemos personas jóvenes que se están preparando en el camino, niños que desde temprana edad investigan de todo tipo de estas situaciones. También tenemos a la mujer como actor principal de las bases de un hogar, que día a día ella también se preocupa y crean o no, ella desde las bases de su hogar también hace un manejo de la gestión del riesgo para su familia. Por eso invito a las personas que se sumen, empresa privada y diferentes organismos ONG, que estos espacios sean complementados también con el sector académico.
Okay, so thank you so much, David. We are cognizant of the 6 UN languages that we are having the interpretation for. But I just want to read some two last feedback, then we could be able to go to the next item. But there is, kindly play that feedback. There's one which is very interesting. It is called Look, Listen, and Link. Yeah, I am very interested in that last feedback there. Look, listen, and link. The ability to look who is around, what are the risks, the specific risks. The ability to listen, no one is left behind, every voice counts, addressing all needs, knowledge, science, and so forth. Link. We are all agents of change, together stronger. I think let's clap for that respondent. Yeah, so thank you so much. So we will keep going back and be getting the responses, and they are really very exciting and very interesting. So we are coming towards the end of our session, and we are going to come to the recommendation session. But before we do that, I want to welcome a colleague of ours, that is Emmanuel Bessler, the Deputy Director of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, to reflect on the key discussions that have come out. What are some of those striking issues that have come out as far as diversity in DRR leadership is concerned?
Thank you very much, Abel. And thank you to the people here in the room, and as I heard, more than 1,000 people online to be here. A very diverse panel, a very active and a very sort of lively panel, which is actually much needed. I made a lot of notes and tried to pick on some of the points that are the most sort of relevant, or where I would like to see some action. What I missed a bit is the actionable. When we go home, we have to take something that we can implement Yes, of course it had to be meaningful. Yes, it has to be interactive. It has to be diverse. But it has to have some action in the end. What turns hazards into disaster? It's the impact on people. And people, as we see around us, are diverse. So, of course, responsible leadership has to be diverse. And in this regard, I think we still have to do a major step forward. We got some great ideas from the panel in which direction this has to be. Diversity needs also, of course, true inclusion. You have to give the people not only a seat at the table, but you have to give them a voice, and you have to give them a recognition. And this, we saw also this morning. I agree, women, of course, are not victims, or not only to be seen as victims, but disaster impact 14 times stronger women and girls than men. So this has to be taken into account. And it's great to hear that women are actors and agents of change. As we heard also regarding, and I really liked Elham's, your statement on people with disability, to see them and to look at their specific skills, their perspective, their experience, their knowledge, and to have them as actors. As you see, as you hear, I underline always the word actor and the word action. That is actually quite important. Then, yes, you mentioned, and there, of course, I look from a specific perspective at the age factor. You know, when you're a bit older, you have experience because of life. And this is an important factor that you have to pass on. And there, of course, it's very important to have the youth, as we have it here on the panel, as we heard it again and again, represented and present. Switzerland, where I'm from, we try to do this, and perhaps we have now the slide on, yes, to do this with the One My Act. That is the 1 Million Youth Action Challenge. We heard it this morning when we discussed where do we stand in terms of implementing the Sendai Framework, engaging youth. So Switzerland with this initiative tries to motivate young people, the younger generation, to take action on DRR and the climate change. This can be in your neighborhood, that you mobilize your neighborhood, I don't know, to take care of the forest that is in the backyard, or that you initiate an initiative of awareness raising in your university or in your school. It might be small, but it's one of the action that is needed. Link up to this One MIAC, and you see that there is a global movement, and that's what Switzerland likes to motivate and to sponsor and to support. Look, we have seen, it's actually in our responsibility, and through all the levels, through all the diversities, through all genders and of course age group, to bring knowledge to scale. In this regard, to tap into the diversity that we have to make the best out of it in order to live up to our responsibility. We need a diverse and inclusive DRR leadership, not only because it's the right thing and it's very popular these days, because it's the only relevant thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Manuel, and I would recommend that you all visit the website of One Mayak, and you will see that young people across the platform are creating a community of best practices that are aligned. So we won't necessarily name them, but it can go in DRR, it can go in climate change, it can go on inspiring each other across all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but definitely it is what we need in terms of actions and in terms of implementation, how we translate these strategies and these action plans on paper to something on the ground. And this actually leaves me or drives me to my very next and final question to our honorable speakers for today. So as we are heading towards the end, and we have been saying or repeating the word action and implementation, and also now in the last intervention of Mr. Manuel, this has also been re-emphasized. So I would like to invite you to share with us one particular commitment or action that you personally or your organization would commit to, or one recommendation that would help driving this conversation forward. So I will start with Ms. Lizra.
Great, thank you so much. My commitment and my recommendation today is that we should all become agents and champions of diversity in DRR leadership. For my organization as a Chamber of Commerce in Dominica and Dominica Rise, and also the Network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce, we have taken that commitment and that step to work towards disaster risk reduction and also inclusion and diversity. We need to look out for the vulnerable among us. So even as a private sector, we can't just think of those who are always present, those who are always at the table. And what we've committed to do is to work in with those who are vulnerable. An example of that would be even our migrant population. So we've created a business resilience toolkit, and 2 weeks ago, I led a training for the Haitian migrant population in Dominica because they are our largest migrant population. So that's even our chamber and our Rise Network taking up the responsibility to focus on those who are vulnerable among us. But also wanted to share that we need to be systemic in how we approach disaster risk reduction leadership. It's not token appreciation. And just like with the private sector, it's not saying that I want to ensure that I have someone of color or I have someone who's differently abled, or we just want to make sure we tick a box. But we want to ensure that we really include persons who are different at the table, and that's a commitment that we are striving towards. It's also not thinking that as a brain, okay, well, I'm the one that's most important. The feet, they're also important. The lungs are important. So thinking of all the different persons within our community, that of course will enable more success in our diversity and our leadership. I did share before about my experience with Hurricane Maria and how the opportunity opened up so that I could have supported disaster risk reduction and that diversity. And I am grateful for those who encourage me, even on a daily basis. My past president, well, the first president I worked with as the executive director, said, you know, Lizra, Hurricane Maria is here. It's the most difficult experience that I've personally had to deal with because our entire country was almost devastated. She said, take it one day at a time. Don't think of it too difficult or too much. And that helped me, even being a young person, stepping into a space that I did not see all the leadership that I needed at the time, but it helped me to be able to include others, to step in there. So I want to encourage all young persons who are tuning in, everyone who feels like they're vulnerable, or those who feel that they're different. Opportunities may come, opportunities may arise, but don't be afraid to step in. We can do a little, then we gain more experience. Then we can do more, and we can grow impact. And I believe that this is one of the reasons, and I'm truly humbled to be here today, to be able to share my experiences, because it was persons who motivated me, who helped me to be able to now take that action and that commitment to encourage you to be a champion in disaster risk reduction leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I can only relate to this, and that's something, thank you for also opening up and sharing a personal story, and I think that we all have in mind a person who have pushed us and who made us believe on what we can do, and it's important that we build this learning curve and not only restrict on what's in there, what's put as rules, but sometimes it's up to us to make it work. Also agree that the private sector should deal with disaster risk reduction as something transversal across the different areas, but also have the ownership towards that. Moving on to Ms. Ilham, if you kindly share with us one key action that you'd like to take forward.
Yes. So my recommendation to all governments, national or local, UN agencies, private sector, civil society, donors, any bodies or entities working on DRR, is that with consultation with organizations and collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities, that work in your area, conduct a general assessment on where are we in inclusion of persons with disabilities in leadership in your organization, in your body, in your entity. Find out the barriers. What are the barriers that hinder their participation, their leadership, and find enablers. What should we do to address those barriers? This is something that you end to actionable points respective to your and relevant to your specific situation, to your specific organization, to add the situation. So maybe you find out that actually there is a law in the country that does not allow growth of persons with disabilities, or there are communication barriers. If there is that stigma that I just talked about in my first intervention, the main way to address that stigma is to do public awareness raising. Use the media, the social media, public media, use persons with disabilities to tell their stories and give them the opportunity to share and to change the attitude. And make sure that more and more leadership positions are being occupied by persons with disabilities. Again, not just on disability. We can be experts on many things, as everyone else, if we are given the opportunity to do so. And consider leadership of persons with disabilities, firstly, because this is their right and your responsibility. Secondly, because this is useful, because they can, as I shared, they can have input that might actually address the disasters. We heard that, you know, the number of disasters is going up, the amount of risk, the amount of harm is going up. So we see that for now, mainstream has been leading and the situation has not really been improving in a way that we hope to. So let's have more diverse leadership, and I'm kind of positive that we will see the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think we're all here positive in this room as we are believing in this happening, and we look forward to contributing to this happening. Moving on to Mr. David, if you can share with us in 1 minute, and I'm sorry, as we are heading to the end of this session, in 1 minute, one key action item that you would like to commit to.
Por supuesto, a seguir generando y ampliando estos espacios para que los jóvenes cuyas ideas sean tomadas en cuenta. Quiero decirles que no se rindan, que no se rindan al primer no podemos, no hay presupuesto o el Consejo no ha aprobado. Sigamos tocando las puertas, unámonos en esfuerzo en beneficio de nuestras comunidades. A todos los países y gobiernos que se encuentran en esta sala, es el momento de tomar el mando, de tomar la batuta y unirnos como comunidades, como poblaciones, y decir, hoy tengo que realizar esto por cada una de las personas que habitan en mi comunidad. No cabe más de recalcar que la necesidad de la articulación de la comunidad y las instituciones públicas y los medios de comunicación, los medios gubernamentales o no gubernamentales y el sector académico es de vital importancia y debemos seguirlos preparando junto a la empresa privada, porque son aquellos que invertir $1 en prevención es invertir 1000 años en cosecha próspera para cada una de nuestras familias, mis estimados.
Thank you so much. Moving on to Ms. Noeline, I do not know if she is still with us online. We would like to hear one key action or recommendation you would like to share with us.
Sure. I'm here. We recommend more governments, CSOs, and others to resource, to amplify, and to work in solidarity with women, LGBTQI people, and wider leadership in informal settlements, rural and maritime areas, to value their leadership, human rights, and recognizing the signs of change in local ecosystems and being able to connect this to the state of the living planet. In that way, we work out together who's causing the disasters, who's working positively to address it, and how we can be with each other in more power to bring about change. This means that we have to work on biodiversity protection. There are certain plants that are absolutely essential for our life, for the rituals of life, for income generation. And some of those cycles are being broken by disasters, by rural-urban migration, etc. And when disasters hit, we need to work on material support, on food aid, on household needs, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, contraception, and EVOR as much as we work on the economic issues. Lastly, we have to always work on socio-economic, ecological, and climate justice together as a whole, because we experience disasters in our whole bodies. And last, let's protect our women environmental human rights defenders and indigenous people, who are the ones who are only 5% of our planet and protecting 80% of our biodiversity. And they are those who are being affected not only by disasters, but by the ways that we are killing our planet right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Ms. Sarah, over to you with the commitment you want to share with us.
Thank you so much. The recommendation I want to share, and this is also an ongoing commitment for UN Women, is the need to work with the key national stakeholders and decision makers to secure real commitments to building women's capacity and opportunity to engage in leadership in DRR at all levels. And these commitments need to be transformed into tangible targets with timelines. This builds in accountability so that we can actually, measure and see and hold accountable for progress. And this commitment is important because we do have an evidence base to show that engaging women in leadership in DRR is not only something that we think it's right, but it's also smart, because we see that this kind of inclusive leadership does produce better results. So I hope that all of us would take this opportunity that's offered to us now to really push this forward. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you so much. Our panelist has been nice interacting with you. And I want to share with you a very small story from my country as we come to the end of our session. I just want to show you diversity in leadership. In my country, the Legislative Assembly, the Constitution made it that there must be one female and one male from various constituencies. So in my country, we have one male, one female at a policy-making level. We also have representatives of people with disabilities in the Legislative Assembly, which make policies. Currently, the Prime Minister for my country is a female, and she's the lead of government business. The Vice President is a female. Now, that is how serious it is. Even the Legislative House, there is leaders, members of Parliament for the elder as well, and even for the youth and the children. It is there and it's working out very, very well. So my last shot on this, I summarized it in a very simple way. I said, one, inclusive leadership means joint policy development, joint policy implementation, joint policy evaluation, and joint success. Let's go and work with everyone for successful Sendai Framework implementation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, and I hope that we will have a day where all these communities, all these categories do not need to actually advocate for their inclusion, be it women, young people, LGBTQI+, elder people, migrants, refugees, and other communities. I hope that we dive into a future where this becomes supernatural as any basic other norms that we are facing today. We look forward to have your efforts from wherever you see it to making sure this is actually happening and to accelerate the implementation of the Sendai Framework. It was a pleasure having you all here today, those in person and those online. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we look forward to having other sessions with you. Thank you for interacting. We need now to vacate the room as the space will be prepared for the next session as per the COVID-19 rules of the conference. And please do not forget to check the GP 2022 agenda to make sure you are on the right time for the next session. Thank you so much and see you soon.
you.